Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest is Jay Williams, chairman of the board of the Milwaukee Public Museum. We'll discuss his prior career in finance and his present experience leading the museum and a whole bunch of other stuff. Jay, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Kevin.
Well, museums are cool, right? I mean, everybody
cool.
who has had any kind of a childhood probably remembers going to their first museum. But it's a business.
It's a business.
It's a business. So tell us a little bit about what the museum business is like.
Well, I look at it, it's, basic business is always our revenues greater than expenses. So I think even in a nonprofit area, you're kind of focused on that. But no different than here at the college, it's really first about the mission. And in the case of the museum, we really try to educate, explore, discover, and preserve the world and its people. It's a natural history museum. It's one of the oldest in the country. Actually, the founding dates back to the 1850s. And it was incorporated, I believe, around 1882. So it's been around a long time. There's over 4 million objects in the collection. It's a 400,000 square foot building, and the attendance is around 500,000 visitors a year.
I mean, that's a pretty large scale operation. That's a lot of people coming in and coming out. And
it is.
I mean, there are things that can't be replaced, so
right.
You need people to preserve them and that sort of thing. I think I saw you at one place said it's a cultural attraction and an academic institution at the same time.
It's exactly where I was just going to go next is, the visitor experience. If you come with your kids or you're taking the tour, we're in about 150,000 square feet of a 400,000 square foot building. The other 250,000 square feet are people working on the collection doing research. We have scientists from all over the world come to the museum to work on the collection. And it really, gets to tell us about the history of man, which is pretty cool.
And of course, the history of Milwaukee is well represented there too. That one of the longest permanent exhibits is, going back to old time Milwaukee. Right?
Yeah, the streets of old Milwaukee. It's always kind of interesting. We're a natural history museum. The streets of old Milwaukee are more a historical experience, not classically the natural history experience, which is really the, if you want to say, the balance of the building.
So you have academics, basically, along with tour guides, et cetera. So what kind of a person goes to work for a museum? Are they pretty much like somebody who would go to work for a college?
You know what? The business model of a museum isn't that different than a college. If you think of it, you have your academic team, and then you have your admissions people, which are trying to get the visitors in. You have development, you're always doing fundraising, trying to maintain the museum. And then you have kind of a team of people that are the operations, the finance, accounting, IT, personnel, all that. In this case, the museum probably runs on average around 120 full-time equivalents. If we have a major exhibit, it might get up to 200 and some people. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of the size of the institution. We find, a lot of people are just passionate about museums and have gone to college in museum fields. And it's always amazing. They just love this business so much, they'll do anything to get their foot in the door to try to start a career in museum.
And I mean, there's probably a lot more people who want to do it than there are jobs available, unfortunately, for those folks. So they probably have PhDs. And
we have a lot of PhDs and advanced degree people who are visitor assistants. They're just trying to find that opportunity within the museum to become an educator, to become a curator. And we're very, very fortunate to have such a high quality staff.
I had the opportunity on a couple of occasions to go to Harvard University. Has a natural history museum there, and it's like stuffed mastodons and stuff like that. Yeah. But you get a chance to understand, it makes it vivid with the idea that, wow, there were professors at Harvard or folks who were private citizens or scientists in Milwaukee that literally would go to faraway places and bring back a penguin or something and put it on display for people, and that was great entertainment before television, right?
Right. Well, I always think about one of the, if you want to say the Babe Ruth of museums, was a guy named Carl Akeley. Carl got his foundation at the Milwaukee Public Museum in the late 1890s. Dioramas as you see them anywhere in the world first started at the Milwaukee Public Museum.
Oh, really?
Carl Akeley built the first diorama, and it was right around 1890. And and at that point, just what you were saying, people would just kind of line up specimens in a row, and you could compare different specimens. He's the first person that took a specimen and put it in its natural environment, so when people would review the object, they could see how it lived. And his first diorama was a muskrat den. It was a kind of Wisconsin river lake, and where you had the muskrats and you could see them in the water and then up in the den. He then went to the Field Museum in Chicago, and then went to the American Museum in New York. And if you've seen Night at the Museum, they're looking into the Carl Akeley Gallery of Mammals. He went with Teddy Roosevelt when Teddy did not run for president again. Teddy went on a couple-year expedition to Africa, bringing back 3,000 specimens. And Carl was his person for that trip, bringing back the specimens to the American Museum in New York.
Wow.
But he started this whole thing at the Milwaukee Public Museum.
Yeah, Roosevelt was kind of an interesting guy, but sort of, maybe he was the last one in the line that began with guys like Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, right? The private citizen, and adventurer type.
Roosevelt could have had a whole career in natural history. He was doing taxidermy as a young boy and wrote some very significant papers on natural history. He was just he was a brilliant man. I mean, think about here at the college, he would read the classics in their native language, whether it was Greek or Latin or German, and he could be fluent in all of that, and I struggle with English. So.
Yeah, I bought the Cliff's Notes.
Yeah, the Cliff Notes. Yeah,
I got through.
It's hard to imagine if you want to say the intellectual capacity of people like Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, it really makes me kind of wonder, we have all these devices at our fingers, and those guys had to work. I mean, they didn't have a National Geographic special on such and so. Right. They had to really do primary research, and it wasn't nearly as discovered. I think those of us that are around now have a hard time understanding that even 100 years ago, there were vast swaths of the planet that were unknown.
Yeah.
Unknown. I mean, maybe the oceans are that way now, and a lot of us live through the space program, et cetera, but this was much more immediate.
It's, in fact, going back on Roosevelt, so then if you remember, he tried to run for president again and lost. He then needed some money, so he went to South America to go on a speaking tour. But on the tour, he was going to go down and explore parts of the Amazon. He discovered a river that was 1,000 miles long that no one knew about. And it's hard to comprehend that. And that's where he contracted malaria and some other things that caused his unfortunate early death. But the River of Doubt is his story about finding this river, and it's just fascinating. But you're right, that's in, what would that be, 1912, how can you find a river 1,000 miles long that no one knew about?
I read a book about 10 years ago that was exactly about that trip, and it was incredible.
It was incredible.
If any of you folks get a chance to take a look at that book, it's really...
The River of Doubt.
River of Doubt. It was a fascinating book and scary. And
Scary.
That was 100 years ago.
Right.
So before we move on to some other stuff about the museum, one of the big things in running museums now is having the big draw. Right. And I think one of the things that you did when you got there was to try to change that marketing piece a little bit. So talk a little bit about what that means. I mean, how do you book those big exhibits?
Well, there's a long story around the traveling exhibits, and I think a lot of it has to change with what's happening in the economy, since the Great Recession. Prior to that, these special large exhibits really drew very well. After that, they haven't drawn as well. And if you go back to the Public Museum, when we had the first Body Worlds exhibit or the Titanic exhibit, we were probably approaching 300,000 visitors just to that exhibit.
Wow.
Now if we have a world-class traveling exhibit, we might get 100,000 visitors to that. And the economics have just changed. And they are not the money makers for museums that they used to be. So you have to be very careful as a museum in booking that exhibit, because you have to make a big investment to bring the exhibit to your institution and make sure that you're comfortable with the business plan of that exhibit, that it's going to generate a positive cash flow. And is it on mission? We're a natural history museum. And then, is it something that you think the community would enjoy seeing, and then is there economics behind it that you're going to at least cover your cost.
Well, I remember in the 70s, the King Tut exhibit was going around, and I mean, they were bigger than Led Zeppelin. I mean,
right.
they would come into town, and they could not manage all the people that wanted to come in and see that. But, you know, I'm convinced part of that is a technology thing, that you can find out so much stuff about anything you can imagine.
Right.
That if you even have the most passing interest in King Tut, go to Wikipedia and you can just look forever, you know?
I think that, but there's something about being able to touch something and that personal experience that you don't get on a two-dimensional device. Now, you might get information, but it's not as experiential as coming to the museum and seeing it. And I think, you know, when we do our market research, we find more and more families in particular want to have those experiences that they can share. And, you know, it's kind of hard to share on your iPad stuff, but when you go to the museum and you go through Cleopatra, you go through the exhibit we had of the pirates, you go through Body Worlds, and you can talk with your kids and they can talk with you, and, you know, it is really good. I do think, you know, what has happened a little bit is if you want to say the ticket price for that just got a little bit expensive for a lot of people, and I think that's been an issue. But museums also have been working at adding technology to their exhibits, so it's kind of an integration of both the old diorama and that physical presence and newer technology that lets you learn even more about the artifact that you're taking a look at.
Well, for me, and I'm kind of 20th century, I guess, but the earpiece with someone explaining why this matters is an easy way for me to kind of get that stuff. Right. And these traveling exhibits, typically it's a whole package of that,
whole
right?
Package,
that they come in with. Well, I want to talk to you a little bit. You mentioned something about the Great Recession, and of course, you know, the bulk of your adult life has been spent in the banking business, right?
Yes.
And so, tell us a little bit about, you know, how that happened, and then I want to ask you a little bit about your take on what happened in the 2000s.
Well, you know, my getting in the banking business goes back to being at St. Norbert, and I worked full time, went to school full time here. And I was fortunate to have Bill Dargan as a professor. And I did a work-study program with him with, at that time, People's Bank in downtown Green Bay. And so you're talking, you know, early 1970, 71. They needed a market research paper done, and they had never done any kind of statistical analysis of their customer base. So we did the old cards, you know, did market research surveys, you know, did computer stuff before computers were computers. And, you know, it got me exposed to banking. So I said, darn, I like analytical stuff. I like relationship stuff. This could be for me. I was one of the people, if you want to say, kind of running the food service here. And the trustees were made up of a lot of bank executives at that time. And Jake Rose, who was the head of, at that time, Kellogg's, which is now Associated, I started asking these guys if they'd write me reference letters. And I'd been feeding them for a couple of years at the trustee meetings, so they knew me. And they did. And I just went around the Midwest with my letters in hand, looking for a job in banking. And January 1st of '73, I started with what was the old First Wisconsin.
Wow.
So
that was, I mean, maybe folks don't remember this, but 73, 74, 75 were not
good years.
Were not good years at all.
No.
That was, you know, the oil shortage and just the economy imploded.
Yeah. And that was the biggest thing in the banking industry. Is quickly thereafter was the REIT fiasco. And that was a
huge... Real estate investment trusts.
Right? Yeah, real estate investment trusts that a lot of banks had invested in, and they went south very fast. And the good news for a young person like myself is anyone that knew anything was sent out to help fix the problem. So us younger people who didn't know anything got to actually run the company. So we got experience well beyond our skill set.
That helps. I mean, luck matters, but I found out that being prepared for something that is lucky is how you create opportunities.
Amen.
So you worked for Associated Bank for...
First Wisconsin.
I'm sorry, First Wisconsin.
First Wisconsin, First Star U.S. Bank for 31 years. And great companies, great people, and I learned a lot. And then I decided to, it was in my late or middle 50s, I wanted to just explore other things. And some people approached me about starting a bank. So I started a bank that was part of the Private Bank Corporation. And then I went on to be chief operating officer of the Private Bank Corporation. It was a public banking company. And I did that for a number of years. And then, I had some personal situations. We lost our son to cancer. And so I decided to step back. And after stepping back, I kind of reflected and could see that I, if you want to say, checked the box on everything I wanted to do in my life in banking. And I've been a very blessed and fortunate person. I just decided I wanted to work in education, government, or nonprofit. And then some people called me about the public museum as a business turnaround situation, and if I would get engaged in that. And that's how I ended up doing the public museum. And then while I was doing that, I was very fortunate that Associated Bank was looking for a bank director with some banking experience, and they approached me. And I couldn't be happier than to be on the Associated Bank board, and Phil Flynn, our CEO, is also a trustee here at St. Norbert, and just an incredibly great leader.
So you mentioned you started your own bank. Now, for those of us not in the banking industry, does that involve just setting up a window and taking people's money? How do you set up your own bank?
Well, I was fortunate. The people that had started the Private Bank Corporation indicated they'd give me money. Literally, I started the bank in the basement of my house at a picnic table, and it was one of those
safe and secure.
It was one of those days where I didn't have a charter. I was starting it, and it was one of those days where you go, geez, I did tell him I'd start a bank. I guess I better get going on it. And I called a person, and Tom Tuttle, and he and I sat at that table and just started step by step putting the bank together and getting the regulatory authority and all the detailed stuff that goes with this. It took us about a year from sitting there the first time to having it up and running.
Is one of the first things you do put all the pens on chains? Is that
the
important thing? No, that's not one of the first
things. You find somebody who knows something about IT. That's the first thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure most people have figured this out, but I mean, that's a very IT-intensive business and relationship-intensive business.
Relationship-intensive, systems-intensive, So it's a wonderful business because, in banking, and I think of, today banking gets kind of a negative connotation, but there's traditional banking, taking deposits, making loans. That's what I grew up doing, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about banking. And you're really helping people fulfill their dreams. They own a business and they want the business to grow. They want to own a home. They want to save for their kids' college. They want to plan for their own retirement. They want to merge a company and buy a company. But it's all, people have dreams, and you're just trying to help them fulfill the dreams and give them good advice and guidance as they walk down that path.
I can imagine. I want to ask you a little bit about, you were in a position to sort of see things as they were unraveling in 2007. In your judgment, what happened? What's sort of the Cliff's Notes, speaking of Cliff's Notes, version of what happened, and could this happen again?
So what happened is, I think there was a lot of people who, if you want to say, was there an element of greed? Probably. Was there a level of not monitoring things properly? Possible. But I think, it ended up being so driven by the housing industry. And I think historically, over the last 50 years, no one had really seen housing go negative. There have been periods where it was flat or down. But I think, that was an issue. I think fundamentally, one of my opinions is there was an expectation that people could own homes that really weren't qualified to own homes. And in that process, they got mortgage debt that they really weren't qualified to handle. People were packaging that mortgage debt and selling it. And no one actually drilled down and said, what if this guy can't pay? The assumption was always a home would have its value, and if they couldn't pay, you would sell the house. But no one anticipated the reduction in real estate values. But I think it was almost to a fault. Society was saying everybody should own a home, and that's really not right for everybody. And people that couldn't afford homes, I think, were led to believe they could afford homes. And that created the fundamental cause of the crisis. And then on top of that, you add in some of the synthetic products that were being used to conceptually offset risk. And it wasn't sound practices. And yet everybody was excited about people owning homes and about the economy growing, and almost like the king has no clothes kind of situation. No one wanted to step back and say, does this really make sense? So,
well, if you think about it, if you had been that person, and there were a few people that were saying, what the heck are we doing here? This person is getting a loan for 5 times their not very reliable salary, and no one checked. I mean, I think the slicing and dicing of it, I remember this, literally, people stopped paying their mortgages here, and banks in Germany were bellying up because they had no idea they had that kind of exposure to.
I mean, if you really take this backwards, so after 9/11, the economy goes into a mini tank, okay? Interest rates come way down. You have a lot of people that historically had bought fixed income products for yield. The yield wasn't there, okay? Well, what ended up happening is people started securitizing residential mortgages and go, wait, I can only get 2 or 3% on a bond, but I can get 5% if I buy this package of securities. And they're going
risk-free.
And it's based on homes. Homes have value. I'm going to take that 5%, 6% security backed by mortgages because it's a lot better. And that just kind of fed itself. And I think that just kind of started as a grass fire, and it just got bigger and bigger.
Well, let's fast forward to, say, the fall of 2008.
Yep.
And things were happening really fast.
Very fast.
What was that like to be kind of watching that?
I don't think the public, John Q. Public, knew how close we came to this economy going off a cliff. And a cliff that is not repairable. It would have been as dramatic, if not more dramatic, than the Great Depression. And that would have been a global event because of the quality of the U.S. in this whole market. But it was, if you go with, Paulson and all those guys that pulled people together and said, folks, this is something none of us have ever thought of, but we've got to, you talk about crisis management. This was crisis management at the peak.
Over a weekend.
Over a weekend, and I remember the weekend. I mean, it was really hard to be in the banking business. And you were like, gosh, I hope we have enough, I hope this is all going to work. But I don't think people realize how close it came. So the aggressive actions the government took to keep the economy going were 100% needed. I mean, you didn't have another choice. And you couldn't wait. I mean, it wasn't something where you go, well, next week, why don't we get back to this after we've all had a chance to think about it. It's literally being in the battle, and people are shooting at you, and you got to make some decisions. And that's what happened over that weekend.
Yeah, I've told my students over the years that we were literally at risk of you going to buy gas and running your debit card
wouldn't work.
And it wouldn't work. And then everything else, your credit card wouldn't work, and nothing would work. And I think people think I'm a little bit
the commercial paper markets froze up. People would take their free cash and buy commercial paper. They couldn't get their cash back.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't get your cash back. You can't pay your payroll. I mean, it just it's a.
And the irony of it is that something like this happened in the early 1900s, and J.P. Morgan was able to fulfill that role.
Yes.
And I think that's going to be a story that, as we kind of get past the emotional experience and the pain that it caused, because there was real pain that happened after that, despite it could have been worse.
Well, one of the things I think you see, and you would know this better than me, but as the economies have become more global, there's actually been longer troughs with. You go back to the early part of the 20th century, last part of the 19th century, there was a dramatic recession about every 5 years. I mean, it was just like, oh my God, and that's where there was always this confidence level about the economy and banking, and if after the 80s, where labor got to be more of a worldwide resource, not a local resource, and we weren't laying people off in this country like we did in the 70s. When the economy tanked in the 70s, I remember, 14% unemployment. Well, over time, those jobs went global. Different jobs filled in here in the States. So, it really prevented, the layoffs now are happening in Indonesia, in China, and Malaysia. They're not happening here, which, we don't have the really good jobs we had when we were primarily a manufacturing economy, but it's also kind of, I think, tapered the swings of recessions and things.
Like a flywheel. In fact, if you look at the recession since World War II, and early on they tended to be very sharp, but the recovery was rapid too. And I mean, people forget that the recessions of the early 1980s, that was really bad. The unemployment rate in this last one, as it's measured, and that's an issue, but never got as bad as it did in 82, 83.
Right. Well, I tell people this, so in the banking business, First Wisconsin asked me to move to Wausau, Wisconsin in 1984, okay? So I went up to get a mortgage in Wausau. It was a 14% mortgage. I had to go back to my boss and say, you gave me a wonderful raise, but I can't move because I can't afford to move. And they had to work to get me a lower mortgage somewhere and help compensate that institution because you couldn't move. And now with these 4% mortgages, for most of my life, I mean, 63, 8% mortgage, 7% mortgage, those were all good rates. I remember in '86, people lining up at the bank when I was in Wausau, refinancing at just under 10%, thinking it was a beautiful day.
My wife and I got our first mortgage in 1986, and we got 10, I think it was 10 and a quarter or something like that.
It was
and
a beautiful
I thought
day.
I was the smartest guy in the world.
Exactly.
Not so much, as it turns out.
Exactly.
Well, I want to talk to you about another public service project
Yes.
you involved yourself with, which is the Milwaukee Stadium District.
Yes.
So you were the chair of the
Miller Park.
Miller Park, right?
Yeah. So it's technically called the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Professional Baseball District. But it's Miller Park, and I was lucky to be chairman there for 8 years, and it was really fun. It was interesting in the beginning because we were working through the challenges of the construction project, and some of the issues we had that the building was not at the level that we thought it should be at. So there was a bunch of litigation back and forth on the construction. That has nothing to do with the tragedy of the workers coming. That's totally separate. But it was kind of fun to work through that process of trying to get everything done to, if you want to say, get the building to the level that was the expectation that the taxpayers had for the quality of the building.
Well, I mean, mission accomplished, because I'm sure you saw this, that, I forget who it was, it might have been ESPN, but it was somebody that polled folks and asked them what's the best stadium experience in the country, and it's Miller Park. And I have to agree with that. I'm a Cub fan, but I still, I think Miller Park is the best place to watch a ball game.
It's incredible.
Obviously, as the chair of our board here, you have an opportunity to meet students. What advice do you give to students that are here now? If they look at you and say, boy, I really want that kind of life, what do you...
This would sound overly simplistic. Work hard and do the right thing. I think too often people think too much about their career, and get with a good organization, work for good people, but just work hard and do the right thing, and good things will happen. And I think early on in your career, you have to develop the processes of how you personally operate. What makes you tick, and come up with processes that allow you to be successful.
Well, that's good advice, but like most good advice, it's easy to understand and sometimes hard to do, right?
It is.
Because if it were easy, everyone would do it.
There's so many things in life that are simple, they're just not easy, right?
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate
it.
This.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and I hope all of you enjoyed our show as much as I did. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.